Well, welcome everybody. We have quorum, so we're going to get started. Welcome to meeting 8 of the Board of Health. To members of the board, to members of council in attendance today, as well as members of the public. You can follow the agenda and debate on your computer, your tablet, or your smartphone at toronto.ca/council. The Board of Health acknowledges the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and it's now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I'm going to begin by seeing if there are any declarations of interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act. Seeing none, can I have a confirmation of the minutes from June the 10th, 2019, moved by Councillor McKelvey. All those in favor, opposed if any, carried. We have a number of presentations at today's meeting, so we'll walk through the yellow sheets. Item 8.1, Toronto Urban Health Fund Indigenous Funding Stream. We have a presentation and speakers, so that's held. Item 8.2, 2019 Toronto Urban Health Fund Allocations and Review Process. That item is, there's no presentation and no speakers.
I'll move the staff recommendations. Moved
by Councillor Layton. All those in favor, opposed if any, that carries. Item 8.3, Toronto Urban Health Fund Priorities and Objectives for years 2020 to 2026. We do have a speaker listed on that, so that will be held. Item 8.4, Public Health Implications of the Proposed Increase in Access to Alcohol in Ontario. Would anybody like to hold that item? Does anybody have questions on that? Okay, Councillor Perks, would you like to move that? Oh, my apologies. I am to refer to everybody by director last name, not councillor and non-councillor. Director Perks. This was from last meeting. Director Mulligan.
Yeah, well played, Director Mulligan.
No, you are Director Mulligan. No, not in this chamber. All right, moved.
Refer to everyone as Director Mulligan. Dr. Mulligan.
All right. Moved by Director Perks. Can I ask for a recorded vote on this one? I don't know. All right.
So all in favor of the staff recommendations, please lift your hand. Ashna Bowery, Trustee Stephanie Donaldson, Cynthia Lai, Mike Layton. Well, okay, I guess.
You have to choose one. You got to go with one or the other.
Director Joe Cressy. Director Jennifer McKelvey, Director Gord Perks, Director Peter Wong, and Director Sue Wong.
All right, that carries unanimously. Thank you. Item 8.5, Impact of the Provincial Budget Announcement. We're going to hold that for a presentation. With that, we are going to dive right in. Item 8.1, Toronto Urban Health Fund Indigenous Funding Stream. We have a presentation.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Good morning, directors. My name is Donald Corbier, and I'm working in the Indigenous Affairs Office, but I'm really happy to be here this morning to support my previous team members actually at Toronto Public Health, and very happy to see Eileen here as well. We wanted to get things started in a good way with opening up with some words, so what we've done is we've offered Sharon some tobacco to open us up with some words and some ceremony, open us up in a good way, and then we've also offered our friend Summer here as well some tobacco so that she can burn some medicines. And when we're burning medicines and we're doing a smudge, we're calling in the grandmothers, grandfathers, helpers, and spirits to come and be present, and for us all to connect in a good way, but also connect with our own spirits and connect with each other's spirits. And so we're really asking everyone to come together in a good way and connect in a good way. So miigwech for your time, and we appreciate you allotting this for us. So I'll let Sharon open us up with some words. Okay, miigwech.
It's weird doing this from sitting down. I'm usually standing up, so please let me just get comfortable for a second. My name is Sharon Whitrock. I'm Mohawk. I'm Wolf Clan. My family comes from the Wata Territory, which is a small reserve up near Owen Sound, near Perry Sound. Summer's going to burn some sage, and she's only going to be smudging the space. We're not going to bring it around to each individual person. Smudging the space helps us it's literally about holding space for good conversation. So I want to thank you for allowing us to have the opportunity to open this day in a good way. I'm going to really quickly just acknowledge the 4 directions. In the eastern direction, we have the gift of vision and warmth and sunlight, because the sun satisfies its responsibility every day by rising in the east and making it possible for us to have life. The southern direction teaches us about growth and development, and the way that we do that as adults as we move through this world, as we continue to grow and develop our minds. It gives us the gift of knowledge and understanding. In the western direction, we're taught about the necessity of reflection. At the end of the day, when the sun is going down, we have a beautiful opportunity to sort through the details that have happened to us throughout the day, and we can take an opportunity to choose which lessons we will carry with us into our next day and which we will leave beside the path so that we don't need to carry them with us. And if we spend the time reflecting on those events, we don't carry unnecessary things with us into the next day. The northern direction teaches us about spirit and moving in balance, ensuring that there's a connection between the truth in our heart and the truth in our head. When we feel that heaviness where the things that we are saying or doing don't sit right with us, sometimes we refer to it as a gut check. Oftentimes it means that our heart and our head are in conflict, and it's important to sustain balance in those ways. And in those ways of acknowledging each of the 4 directions and the gifts it brings to us every single day, it allows us to actually have access to those spaces of balance. So thank you very much for allowing me to say these words to begin the day. And I'm excited to share with you a presentation that we've built that describes some really gratifying and valuable work that we've undertaken as an Indigenous advisory circle. I'm just going to move this closer so I can reach.
I have a short cord. I think you're going to have to maybe.
That's cool. Okay. So as I said, I'm here representing the advisory circle of the Toronto Indigenous Health Fund, and we are 4 advisory council members. The interesting thing is that we come from 4 different nations, so we represent that diversity of Indigenous community. So we represent the Indigenous community in the best way that we know how. We use our relationships, we use our voice, and we use our reputation to try to ensure that we're effectively and responsibly carrying that voice. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to share with you a proposed model of the Toronto Urban Health Fund Indigenous funding stream. There was a life cycle to this process that some of you may be aware of, that in June of 2015, that there was a conversation with the Board of Health to talk about how to ensure representation of Indigenous communities on the TUF review panel, Toronto Urban Health Fund review panel. In 2016, there was a report in consultation with the Indigenous Health Advisory Circle that helped actually design what that might look like. And what a fund might look like. And throughout this entire process, we've tried to sustain the Toronto Indigenous Health Advisory Circle, their recommendations and their structures that have already been developed. As the saying goes, there's no point in reinventing the wheel. So in September of 2017, the Board of Health determined the feasibility of establishing a fund specifically for the Indigenous community within Toronto. Following that in the fall, there was the formation of the Indigenous Advisory Circle, and the 4 members are Elder Ed Bennett, who's unfortunately not able to join us today. He's under the weather, myself, Jessica Demera, and Alyssa Lutenberger, who you will hear from a little bit later on. We've had 11 meetings, and we've conducted 2 community-wide consultations, and we've had 2 meetings with the Toronto Aboriginal Support Services Council. Those meetings with the Support Services Council were an integral part of this process because they represent the interests of the social service serving Indigenous agencies in the City of Toronto. So we have developed some operating principles. These are principles that dictate exactly how we're going to behave, how we will behave responsibly in representing the needs of Indigenous community. These operating principles ensure that we align with THAC and that our primary sort of goal here is to reduce health inequalities for Indigenous peoples. Those 2 points are really paramount. There's a phrase that you may hear from time to time that talks about nothing about us without us. So it's important for us to ensure that we have Indigenous peoples as full partners throughout the entire process. We build the capacity of Indigenous leadership and Indigenous communities to care for themselves. So that was sort of when we were identifying what the funding model would look like. We needed to make sure that it had a capacity building element to it. We are hoping to influence social determinants of health for Indigenous populations, and that requires us to look at a connection in terms of the established and researched social determinants of health, but connecting that back to some of the cultural foundations that we have understanding of within community. We're hoping to improve access to Indigenous healing and knowledge and practice. For a long, long time, Indigenous knowledge and healing has been sort of downplayed within mainstream health provision processes. So it's important to recognize that and elevate it and to understand the validity of those approaches. We're seeking to harmonize Indigenous and mainstream health programs and services. So that talks about that idea of connecting those two worldviews together. There's something called two-eyed seeing, which means that we have to have an understanding of how to see the world through sort of the colonized lens as well as through an Indigenous lens. So that's what we've attempted to do at every step of the way as well. And we're hoping for dedicated resources and funding for Indigenous health programs and services to support a coordinated and collaborative system. So this means that we're looking to ensure that we're sort of responding to the existing inequities by ensuring that there's dedicated resources. The key features of the Indigenous funding stream, these are sort of highlights. It was a complex process that we used to get to this point, but the key features, how it is different from the existing funding model. It's a developed funding approach with priorities that use a holistic framework. So that, as I described earlier, we looked at original sort of the existing tough priorities, and we identified how those are aligned with Indigenous cultural holistic approaches. We clarified some eligibility criteria for Indigenous organizations. So we established what would that look like, what actually constitutes an Indigenous organization. We ensured that all of the approaches that we used were accessible and culturally relevant, including the reporting tools and the application process itself. That was one of the benefits of having such a broad diversity of Indigenous council members on the circle. We looked for improved flexibility in the budget for Indigenous cultural and traditional materials, recognition that sometimes Indigenous elders, honoraria, or you might need to purchase tobacco through a program like this. So we need to make sure that the budget would be able to permit things like that. We defined how a formation of an Indigenous review panel, what that might look like. And then we discussed at great detail tailored support for project successes. So this talks about how the Toronto Urban Health Fund would support successful applicants in a way that was culturally relevant and respectful. The next slide actually shows for us what the funding model looks like. So this describes the Toronto Urban Health Fund funding stream objectives. The existing stream was 3 categories, and it had sort of bulleted objectives that were listed under each of these 3 categories. What we actually did is reimagined many of the objectives that existed currently, and we interpreted them through a healing wheel process. So this healing wheel, you'll see other healing wheels that look very similar to this one in other environments. There was one that was created by the Aboriginal Healing and Wellness Strategy, which was a very large strategy that involved several different Indigenous community members, agency representation, as well as several ministries from throughout the province. And it was one of the first of its kind to be generally accepted. So we used that as a platform to understand how we might reinterpret these ideas that currently exist within the Toronto Urban Health Fund. We separated them into 4 directions, which means that those same teachings that I explained to you this morning, they are taken into consideration. There are sections that allow us to interpret the programming from a physical, mental, emotional, or spiritual lens, as well as recognizing that these programs may need to engage anyone along any stage of the life cycle. All of the work that we've done has been culture-based and community-driven. We ensured that we had many, many really good philosophical conversations about which teachings or how we interpret the teachings to try to ensure that we were not eliminating anyone from being able to integrate or participate with the information or the program, and but at the same time making it as widely accessible. So again, it's a holistic model that's consistent with Indigenous worldviews. It needed to be flexible so that community response could be driven by community. The community itself knows and understands what it needs in order to respond to the issues, and we need to create funding frameworks and models that will give them room to make those designs and activate them. Each of us were very concerned with ensuring that whatever product we developed was a trauma-informed design. I'm not going to explain trauma-informed approach because I'm sure that that's something we all understand. And we wanted to make sure that it was inclusive of all Indigenous peoples and life stages. We were pretty specific in terms of who qualifies for funding, and we created a very specific set of criteria. There was some minor pushback from within community, but when we were able to discuss it with them and understand what their concerns were, we were able to respond to those concerns. We needed to make sure that each organization was a nonprofit with a head office in the City of Toronto, and that the projected activities would take place in Toronto, except if they were doing on-land experiences that might need to be undertaken outside of the City of Toronto. We would need signed audited statements, and we would need to have letters patent that describe an Indigenous mandate. And then if at least 50% of the board of directors of Indigenous ancestry, or the organization is primarily staffed by people of Indigenous ancestry. And we were hoping that an organization can use Indigenous service model for their work with their clients and their in-service users. And the value of that is that, because as I said, there's so much diversity within the City of Toronto amongst different Indigenous groups, that does not need to be defined by this process or by the council. It needs to be defined by those organizations themselves. And that any non-eligible Indigenous organizations, they would require an eligible Indigenous sponsor. So we're hoping that they would trustee their work through an Indigenous organization that is qualified. The Indigenous Funding Stream Review Panel, this is an interesting sort of approach. It's a very small review panel, and I think it's necessarily small. We have 4 members of the Indigenous Advisory Circle, which you can see around the outside circle, and that currently is the existing advisory circle members that we have right now. 4 review panel members would indicate their interest through an expression of interest, and then they would be in agreement with the terms of reference, and there would be an honoraria provided to them for participating on the review panel. Once their term as a review panel member has expired after an application process, they then become the next cycle's Indigenous Advisory Circle. What this does is it ensures that we have a consistent institutional memory that describes how and what needs to be achieved through this project. The review panel composition would include, obviously, terms of reference. The composition itself ensures diverse representation from within the Indigenous community in the City of Toronto, and we're looking for lived experience, and that lived experience is something that is mostly open to interpretation by the individuals who are applying. And we're seeking, as I said, 4 members. Their governance and decision-making would happen through a non-defined member's role. So that means that we don't necessarily have anyone identified specifically as a chairperson, and that the review panel would be able to identify for themselves, do they want to have a rotating chair? Do they want to have someone specific in place? Or would they prefer to operate using the consensus decision-making model, which we will also share with you? One of the first processes we encountered when we were working together as an advisory circle was how would we make decisions. This process was actually determined and created by the Indigenous Advisory Council with support of a facilitator who helped us to identify that What we really wanted to do was to have full consensus amongst our council members, and that might take things a little bit longer, but if we have a path to follow, we can actually get there in the end. So the process is a circular process. You can see that you would come in from the right-hand side there, decision point required, and then you go around the circle. And the members could be, I'm going to use the term loosely, could be polled to identify what it is that they're actually, what their feeling is on whatever the decision is. And then we would work in a circular process to try to understand what are people's positions, what are their sticking points, what are their concerns, and try to respond to each of them until we can get to a point where we have a decision reached. The Indigenous Review Panel would assess proposals for merit with tailored and standardized tools developed using an Indigenous framework. So this means looking at those healing wheel approach that we talked about earlier, using that as a criteria of understanding what the applicants are asking for. But there would also be conversation with the applicants to specifically give them an opportunity to describe what it is that they're trying to achieve through their application. The meetings would be administered through the city clerk's office using the approved city committee procedures, and that there would be an elder or a lead of Indigenous review panel who would make recommendations through a joint report with TUF and their review panel to the Board of Health for annual approval. The project management and support, this was something that was really important to us. It's one thing to bring a life into this world, it's something else entirely to take care of it. So we needed to make sure that Toronto Urban Health Fund was going to be able to support these projects to be successful. So we work to make sure that Toronto Public Health and community resources are available for successful delivery of projects, and we work to ensure that the project management and evaluation approach within the applicants were appropriate, as well as within the Toronto Urban Health Fund. We advise them to continue to build and sustain partnerships and relationships with the Indigenous service providing community to make sure that this is not, we're not coming in cold. A relationship with an Indigenous organization doesn't begin at the finalization of a contribution agreement or service contract. It should begin considerably sooner. And we want to make sure that we're able to capture successes and challenges through the reporting and evaluation. So not as much to measure the value or I don't know how to, putting a number to it or a pass-fail, but we really need to recognize that it's about capturing successes and challenges. The launch of the Indigenous funding stream, we're aiming for a 2020 funding cycle, and it's dependent on the 2020 public health funding. There are two project phases, a 1-year and a 3-year project funding cycle. September 23rd, we're hoping to be able to open the expression of interest, and then November 25th will be a request for proposals. And that brings us to our close. Was I under 10 minutes? That was my big pressure. Did I do it?
We didn't time you.
Nobody timed me. Come on, this is like the Olympics for me. I was excited about this.
So how we'll proceed here to directors is we'll start with questions we may have for the presentation. Then we're going to go to deputants. Then we're going to take it in to hear from staff. So questions from directors. Director McKelvey.
Hi, thank you. My question is, how does when you assess the grants, like how are you looking at, is gender, is it, affecting both men and women, and ages, and how are you incorporating all those sorts of criteria into your evaluation process to make sure that we're helping everyone?
It's a great question. So we do have the application process itself, the proposal application. It asks you who you will be working with, but what's critical about it is that it actually is permissible to achieve a response for any and all genders and life stages. So the existing funding model could be interpreted as being somewhat restrictive, considering there was one particular objective that said for child and youth resiliency. That would lead you to believe that if you were talking about harm reduction or eliminating substance use or abuse, that maybe children and youth don't belong in that objective category. So changing the objective categories actually opens the door so that anyone can be reflected in any one of the categories rather than making specification based on gender or stage of life.
And so when your applications come in, if they seem like they're more heavily weighted towards one group, is there a way to work with the applicants to maybe broaden, so if too many come in for women, for example, that you can
Right.
kind of broaden and work with the applicants so that they might be able to accept a wider range of
Sure, and I think that that would be a conversation that would happen during the application process. This is not just a cut and dry closed application process. We've encouraged Toronto Public Health to reach out and ask questions and to have those conversations during the application process. There may be a very good and very logically founded reason to focus on one particular demographic rather than keeping it broad, but it is worth investigating. So it would be a question that would be had during the application process.
So in addition to looking at the applications on a one-on-one, you'll also do kind of a holistic look at the package that goes forward for all those that you decide to fund to make sure nothing's falling through the gaps.
I actually don't know the answer to that question. I'm just going to turn around for a second here. I'm being told yes.
Okay, great, thank you. Miigwech, thank you.
Thank you, Director McKelvey. Director Layton.
Yes, thank you very much. Just a couple questions about the review panel. So is the intent of the Indigenous advisor, that the existing Indigenous advisory circle be maintained until we create that institutional knowledge along the way?
So the existing Indigenous Advisory Circle would continue on in a mentorship role to be able to support the incoming 4 proposal review members.
And how will we be recruiting the review panel members? Because we have given direction from the Aboriginal Affairs Committee to empower staff to try to increase the number of Indigenous identifying individuals in our boards and commissions. We have a difficult time doing it.
I understand.
Filling those spots.
Yeah, and we've seen that same difficulty even in terms of recruiting for the advisory circle itself. It
Really?
was challenging. Some of the barriers that we experienced throughout this entire process and having conversations about the review panel members as well as the advisory circle, it has to do with the people who are best situated to be able to provide those supports and their advice and their wisdom. They tend to already be employed in other places, and their employers are not always eager to let them do this kind of work, off the dime, and people can't always afford to leave their job to do it. So when we had conversation, one of those 2 conversations with the Toronto Aboriginal Support Services Council, we asked the executive directors of Indigenous organizations about that, and we asked them, would it be possible for you to keep them on payroll? Or if we can provide an honoraria for their time that they're going to do this work, if you're going to keep them on payroll when they're doing this service, they could sign their honoraria back or whatever. Is there a way that we could negotiate that? Could they be permitted as the employer? And we received some encouragement from the Indigenous organizations executive directors, which was great. Additionally, it goes back to relationship. So when I talked about how relationships with Indigenous organizations doesn't begin at the contribution agreement or the service contract, it begins so much sooner. So what that means is that Toronto Urban Health Fund needs to be present. They need to be a face that can be seen by Indigenous community members, both within who work for social support agencies as well as clients who work for social support agencies or access services. So what that could mean is just showing up to AGMs, showing up to meetings, showing up to do volunteer work, just showing up and having a face. Once the community becomes familiar with seeing these people and recognize them as being trustworthy and reliable, then it's a little bit more of a reasonable ask. Rather than going up to a stranger and saying, can you do this thing for me? You're going up to a friend and saying, we could really use your help.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Director Layton. Any other questions? I see no other questions, but can I just say a tremendous thank you to the Indigenous Advisory Circle. I mean, not only for your time in the presentation, but the model and the deep care and thoughtfulness with how it's being developed. And I think that it really when we started down this path as the Board of Health in 2015 and 16, I don't think we could have imagined such a comprehensive and thoughtful model to be developed. Now the onus is on us to make sure that we can see it through. So thank you.
Thank you. On behalf of the Indigenous Advisory Circle, thank you very much for giving us the space to talk today.
Wonderful. So we're now going to move to deputations. We have 2 speakers, and our first speaker is Beth Rachelis from the, and I apologize for the mispronunciation there, from the University of Toronto. So you can take a seat. I will use the clock now that we're in formal deputation, so you'll have up to 5 minutes, and there's a clock you'll see on my right, and you can begin whenever you're ready.
I'm an epidemiologist, which means that I study diseases, and I have been working in the field of HIV since 2002. I'm older than I look, actually. People tell me I look a lot younger. And I have a faculty appointment at the University of Toronto in the Dalalana School of Public Health. I am also currently working at the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences, which we now call ICES. And I have experience working globally and throughout Canada, including in Vancouver, where I spent a lot of time doing work around harm reduction and HIV in the downtown east side. And I can tell you that everything that the presentation said today is supporting what the evidence says. We know that HIV in particular is disproportionately affecting Indigenous peoples in Canada. In 2014, I know the data is a bit outdated, but in 2014, there were 18.2 new infections per Indigenous people, primarily infecting First Nations, per 100,000 Indigenous people, which compared to 6.2 for non-Indigenous people. So we know that it's completely disproportionate. At the same time, there were about 20% of all new infections were among Indigenous people, again, primarily First Nations. And we know that Indigenous people represent, 4% of the Canadian population. So we're talking huge inequities. I can tell you that I've done a lot of work working in the social determinants of health, and you cannot treat HIV without taking into consideration the social determinants of health. That includes things like housing. We know that we're dealing with a massive opioid crisis right now that we need to be addressing. We're talking about violence, the legacy and the continued ongoing impacts of colonialism, of trauma, of displacement of communities from their families. And any program that's going to work needs to take into consideration the broader social determinants of health and needs to take a holistic approach. About a year ago, I did a feasibility study as part of a non-governmental organization called Dignitas International, which I had worked with throughout my PhD in Malawi. And I was tasked with looking at HIV and related illnesses among Indigenous peoples in Canada. And this involved a fairly extensive literature review, as well as conversations with key informants, so people working in the field of HIV and harm reduction throughout Canada. And I can tell you that when we ask what works, we know what the problems are. As I just mentioned, we know that there's huge inequities, we need to address the social determinants of health. But I can tell you that any promising practices that emphasize Indigenous people's right to self-determination, anything that's community-driven, that comes from the community, that's delivered by the communities, anything that takes a holistic approach is what works. Anything that emphasizes cultural safety and cultural appropriateness works. So whatever what the presentation talked about in terms of taking and focusing on Indigenous principles is what's going to work. Priority areas include increased access to prevention treatment. Indigenous peoples tend to do worse in terms of HIV care. So even once people are getting tested and are going to visit a doctor, they are still seeing worse outcomes in terms of being less likely to have a suppressed viral load, which means that the virus in their body is still elevated enough that they're sicker, and people are delayed even accessing treatment, and that comes from a huge span of issues. You can't treat this in isolation. Harm reduction, HIV, they all have to be treated together. You have to take a holistic approach, and I want to support, I guess I'm the science person for this speaker talk, but I want to emphasize that any cut to this would be a direct violation of the TRC calls to action number 23. So it would be important to consider that if we are going forth in the spirit of truth and reconciliation. And I will stop there.
Thank you. Any questions of Beth? Okay, thank you very much.
No problem.
Our next speaker we have is Alyssa Lutzenberger. So, whenever you're ready.
Okay, perfect. Halito, Chakmachin Chakma, Sahol Jafat Lakna Talapojik, Chickasaseya, Chickashanompa, Anobalili, Chakmakio. Good morning, everybody. My name is Alyssa Lutenberger. I'm Chickasaw Nation, I'm Turtle Clan, and then the spirit name that was gifted to me was Lakna Talapojik, meaning Yellow Butterfly Woman. I currently work at the Native Canadian Centre of Toronto as the Mino Matsuin, meaning That Good Way, program coordinator in the youth program. I'm here today to talk to you about the importance of the tough Indigenous stream and our need as Indigenous people to self-determine what culturally competent programs and services look like. I've seen the good work that Toronto Urban Health Fund team has done through my roles on the Indigenous Advisory Council, as a previous member of the Grant Review Panel, and as an employee of an agency with TUF funded projects. I want to thank TUF for all the support they've given for doing this hard work in our community. The Indigenous community has expressed to TUF through consultations, interviews, feedback, and the refusal from some organizations to apply for funding that they do not see themselves reflected back in the way that the funding program currently works. Our leaders have cited concerns around cultural competency, project reporting and evaluation, and how to explain the importance of our traditions and history in relation to health promotion work. TUF has always responded and listened to these concerns, and the Indigenous stream will further contribute to this work. This effort to establish an Indigenous stream, to have it developed with Indigenous people instead of just for Indigenous people, and the care that has been demonstrated around consultation is an essential step forward. The Indigenous funding stream is a model which can be adapted and utilized as a best practice for working with Indigenous communities. We are all working towards wellness. The issue we have run in is the need to balance both Western and Indigenous ways of knowing, doing, and healing. The default is often to assume that these two perspectives stand in opposition to one another, when in reality they show two different ways of seeing. When we find ways to integrate the two of them together, that is when we can work towards the healing and wellness of our communities. The key in health promotion for Indigenous people is reestablishing our connection to community and the land. This concept is not at odds with resiliency concepts of self-esteem, self-efficacy, and relationship building. Attending ceremony, working with elders, these actions are all about learning who you are in relation to the world around you. It is about establishing connections with support in the community who will help you walk that good path. What is missing, though, is that we need to leave space for our people to advocate for what they need. As a youth worker, I know that our community is intelligent, they carry wisdom, and they know what they need to be well. We know that the path that needs to be taken, but we need to see that path as accessible, non-oppressive, and supportive of our voices. In the TUF projects I currently supervise, we engage youth holistically through substance use circles, health promotion programming, ceremony, youth-led risk reduction programming, and youth governance. Programs that are community-led are essential, as are programs that understand that wellness does not only exist for one facet of ourselves. We need to be looking at health from all aspects to develop and strengthen resilience. The work that we are doing is no longer simply about prevention and promotion. Our communities are facing things that make them unwell, and we are faced with an overwhelming need to find new solutions that are rooted in our culture and in our history. We are no longer looking just at our current health status, but also asking, what does our community need to be healthy in the next year, the next 5 years, the next 10 years, and the next 7 generations? The Indigenous funding stream will give us the support to look at harm reduction barriers and HIV risk factors facing our community in a holistic sense. It will allow us to see beyond the simplistic solution of providing harm reduction supplies and workshops, and allow us to create programs which look at the holistic wellness, meaning the mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual wellness of our communities. This work is essential because it creates opportunities for programs to be developed which do not simply respond, react, or band-aid, but allow us to be proactive in improving Indigenous health in Toronto. The funding stream will allow us to connect Indigenous traditions with intervention techniques in a way which is supportive, acknowledges our own expertise, and was created for us, but more importantly, with us. These concepts are essential as we move forward towards reconciliation, and this stream is a major step where we can meet to walk this path together side by side.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions of Alyssa? Okay, seeing none, thank you. So at this time, we're going to move it into committee then. Are there any members, additional members of the public who would like to speak? All right, thank you. Seeing none, we're going to move it into committee. Questions of staff? All right, I'm going to put myself on the list. I have a few. So just so I can understand, so the history, in 2015, the board began by looking at how we could enhance outreach to Indigenous organizations towards tough funding, which led to exploring the feasibility and design of a specific funding stream, which has been led to the proposal here in front of us today. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
So if I jump ahead, I just want to understand. So item 8.3, which has our Urban Health Fund priorities and objectives for 2020 to 2026, I see 3 funding objectives: prevention of HIV, harm reduction, and child and youth resiliency. Where does this new Indigenous funding stream fit into that? Because I'm looking here and I only see those 3.
So with respect to those areas, those are areas of priority, areas of focus that the fund actually seeks to address. What we're talking about here is a new funding stream, and it would be dedicated funding specific to meeting the needs of Indigenous populations in respect of those 3 priority areas that have been the long-standing priorities of the Toronto Urban Health Fund and continue to be the priorities, as you'll see in the upcoming report.
Okay, so there would be a dedicated Indigenous funding stream, which we would be seeking to have meet one or some of those 3 criteria.
That is correct.
Okay. Then I guess, given that, and we saw in the presentation from the Indigenous Advisory Circle, the new funding for this specific stream is dependent on future funding discussions with the board. Should we not have a motion going through to budget committee on this? I mean, we always, every year at budget, we get our new and enhanced lists. If it's not baked in, how do we ensure that we're doing everything possible to have this as a potential item, be it funded or an enhanced funding request?
So through you, Mr. Chair, I will leave it to the wisdom of the board to decide whether, in fact, you would like to put forward a motion to the Budget Committee. However, it is an avenue that we are committed towards exploring here at Toronto Public Health.
Okay. I mean, I think my sense is that is something. Oh, final question then. Do we have an amount that we have identified we would be seeking for this?
So through you, Mr. Chair, I believe we do, and I think if I could refer it to my colleagues, they might be able to give you the more specific dollar figure that we're aiming for as part of the 2020 budget process.
Thank you. It's about 422,000.
Annually?
Yes.
Okay. Those are all my questions. Thank you. Other questions of members of the board? Director McKelvey.
Thank you, Chair Cressy. Let's say that. Okay, so my question kind of follows on what you had. What is the total of what we're putting in the Urban Health Fund allocations right now? So I know it links more with 8.2, but if there's a motion coming on this, I think we have to have a more fulsome conversation on what that is. So what's that amount right now?
So through the chair, I can tell you what we've got on the table for 2019. So for the one-year projects, it's about $770,000. And for the third year of the 3-year projects, it's about $2.4 million. I'm looking over at my staff. Those are rough figures. I don't have all the, high-level summary. $770,000 for the 1 years, and for the third year of 3-year projects, $2.4.
So for next year, if you're looking for 449 for the Indigenous funding stream, and then you think for the other funding stream will still be 770,000, or will that be decreasing?
Through the chair, I think that will depend on the deliberations that we have. We also need to think about that which our province is doing. We do have an upcoming report later on today's agenda in respect of the provincial budget announcement, so it's a little premature for me to say specifically what we're looking at in total.
And when will we be, what is the typical budget cycle that we put forward our asks for the board? That's usually in the fall?
So through the chair, traditionally, yes, we have a report that comes through the budget committee. We've got a budget committee meeting coming up towards the end of September. It then goes through the Board of Health and then subsequently into the council, the broader city budget process.
Board of Health Budget Committee.
So yes, to be clear, when I say budget committee, I mean the Board of Health Budget Committee, September, towards the end of September this year. Then that committee reports here to the broader Board of Health. And in turn, a recommendation is made, and you'll hear more about this in an upcoming presentation just a little bit later in today's agenda on what the entire budget process looks like. But that would include that it has to go through the city budget process ultimately.
Thank you.
Thank you. Did I see questions from? No. Okay. Any other questions from the board? Okay. Seeing none, we'll move into speakers. Director Layton.
I'd like to provide a small historical footnote that I think could have been added into the report. And that is in June 2014, the Aboriginal Affairs Committee recommended that the Board of Health review its urban health fund as it relates to Indigenous funding. And so I actually believe that that's where the genesis, or I'd like to think that that small but mighty community consultation committee provided that direction to the Board of Health. And it's not because I co-chaired the committee and helped write the recommendation, but that it's nice to see it come back. Like it's nice to see. It's been a long time, but it happened. And it went through what I think is a rigorous and responsible way of developing policy. And this was for a number of reasons. One was there was a concern that the existing urban health fund wasn't capturing the need within the Indigenous community in Toronto, and how the money was being allocated to target the Indigenous community. It wasn't reflective of the principles and sort of foundational thought in Indigenous thought. And so it came from one of our members, and I know that they're going to be pleased that this has gone through this process and is coming back. But I wanted to provide that small historical footnote to the development of this policy, and then just make a couple of remarks. Another reason it came out of the committee was this is reflective of not only the 2010 Statement of Commitment to Indigenous People that the City of Toronto made in working closer and building capacity amongst Indigenous-led organizations, but it's also reflective in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. And while I'm not intimately familiar with the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, I can guarantee you it's in there in the calls to justice that we develop specific funds. I can all but guarantee you that it is there. So I think that this is a very positive step forward that the Board of Health is taking. It's difficult to section out groups and say, we need to put priority here, we need to put priority there, oh no, you get a set aside. It's difficult to do that, I understand it, but given just the consistency that the Indigenous community in Toronto and across the country have made this request and have said, this is what reconciliation looks like, this is what justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls looks like, this is what a respectful relationship and path forward together it looks like. And so I think two very, I think unique and beautiful things about this. One is the review panel, the way that it feeds into the advisory circle. I think that's unique, and we probably should be using that model on most of our committees, where we try to drive and directly recruit from committees so that there's this institutional knowledge moving forward. And then second is the decision-making model. I've never seen sort of a collaborative decision-making model Venn diagram before, it laid out like that. And I think it's a good lesson that those are the conversations you have as a group as you try to make it to a consensus position. Not that they all end up being yeses at the end of the day, but you have an opportunity to fully discuss them. So it's nice to see that represented in that way and now documented so that we can share it with others. So thank you very much, miigwech, to the advisory panel, to the Aboriginal Affairs Committee, who hopefully will start meeting soon with our new staffed up Indigenous Affairs Office, which is I guess in its second year now.
Thank you. Any other speakers? All right. I'm just a few words on my end. There has been, and you saw it in the presentation, and further amplified here by the chair of our Aboriginal Affairs Committee, Mike Layton, that there's a long history on this. And I think when it comes to the Toronto Urban Health Fund, we've always sought to develop and utilize the fund to target high-risk populations, often with thematic areas. But I think there's a real recognition, and there's a recognition that for too long we have not had a specific and targeted focus on Indigenous populations, still with a focus on HIV prevention and child and youth resiliency and others. But for too long we've missed a focus here, and a focus that, as has been alluded to, the TRC recs have said needs to be addressed. And so what I really appreciate about what's in front of us here is that the design of the model has been one that really speaks to, and it was said earlier, the principle of nothing about us without us. That this wasn't simply about saying we're adding a new funding stream, hope it works out. Rather, we desperately want to create an Indigenous funding stream that works. And I just want to give real credit to the Indigenous Advisory Circle for, I think, doing the hard work to make sure that we've developed a funding stream that will work. As it relates to the next steps in us, item 8.3, which we're going to be dealing with next, is where we're talking about the funding priorities and objectives for 2020 to 26. And I will have an amendment coming around ensuring, even though I trust that staff are going to be doing their work internally, given how long-standing a priority this has been to bring forward that request, I want to make sure that that is captured and we do not, as a board, lose sight of it. So I'll have an amendment on that, though it will be, as we're going to hear later in this agenda, it is an uncertain budget year. Uncertain because the province is still trying to figure out what it believes when it relates to public health. And so we will do our part to ensure that public health writ large and the Indigenous stream as a focus are both protected, but there is still uncertainty. And so there is work ahead for us. With that, I think we conclude there's not even a motion for receipt. This was solely a presentation. So thank you again to the deputants in the circle. And we're now going to move on to our next item.
So we do just need to receive.
Oh, we do need to receive it. Can I have Director Lai, motion for receipt? All those in favor? Opposed, if any? Carried. Okay, we're now going to move on to item 8, the Toronto Urban Health Fund funding priorities and objectives for years 2020 to 2026. We do not have a presentation, but we do have a registered speaker. Is there a Marc-Andre Hermanstein here? Do I have a Marc-Andre? I don't. Are there any other members of the public who wish to depute on this item? Okay, seeing none, move it into committee. Any questions of staff? Okay. We're now going to move to speakers. Did I, members of the committee to speak? Okay. Seeing none, I will kick it off, and I have an amendment, and that is for, if it can be put on the screen, that the Board of Health request that the medical officer of health to include $422,000 for the Toronto Urban Health Fund Indigenous funding stream. Sorry? Are we on 8.2? No, 8.2 was endorsed. Oh, yeah. Sorry. That's okay. Did you have questions on 8.3 before I kick it off? No, okay. So it's to increase that the MOH include the $422,000 we've just talked about for the Indigenous funding stream in Toronto Public Health 2020 operating budget submission. For members of the board, if you're new to the board this term, the way in which we run through the budget process here, we have a special Board of Health Budget Committee where we work with Toronto Public Health staff to oversee their budget submission. And we're going to have a presentation coming on that later on the agenda. So we, as the Board of Health Budget Committee, and then this Board of Health, we endorse our budget, and then that is submitted to the city to go through their process. And so we're in an uncertain budget time. The Toronto Urban Health Fund is a critical funding stream for organizations on the front lines, and on the front lines of issues that we talk about nearly every month here, whether it's overdose and harm reduction or child and youth resiliency or prevention of HIV, and indeed, as we've talked about here, the Indigenous stream. And so all of us in this uncertain times, I think, are going to have to fight like heck to ensure that the Toronto Urban Health Fund continues to be funded on a go-forward basis, and that it is expanded to include the Indigenous funding stream that we've worked so hard to bring forward. So those are all my comments here. Does anybody else wish to speak? Seeing none, we'll first move my amendment. All those in favor? Opposed, if any? That's carried. And on the item as amended, all those in favor? Opposed, if any? That has carried. Thank you. Okay, we are now moving on to our final item of the morning, and that is that which we've referred to a number of times this morning, which is item 8.5, the impact of the provincial budget announcement. And we're going to start with a presentation from our staff. But before that, are there any members of the public here who wish to speak on item 8.5? We don't have anybody registered. Okay, seeing none, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. DeVille.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And good morning again to members of the Board of Health. I will be taking you through this presentation entitled Impact of the Provincial Budget Announcement, and we'll be happy to take any questions you may have thereafter. So, starting off with slide number 1, going to give you a little bit of a recap, very, very high-level summary and recap of that which has been announced by the province as part of their budget, which was delivered or handed down on April the 11th. Just by way of reminder, you may recall that provincial budget announcement provided a number of changes for public health. And what was announced at that moment in time was an adjustment to the provincial municipal cost sharing on public health funding, the establishment or the intent to establish 10 regional public health entities and 10 new regional boards of health with a common governance model by 2020-2021. And they also indicated an intent to achieve annual savings of about $200 million by fiscal year 2021-2022 through those regionalized changes and some governance changes. And finally, through the budget, what was announced was the investment of $90 million for a new low-income seniors dental program. Subsequent to the April 11th budget announcement, there was an April 18th discussion hosted by the Ministry of Health, then Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, and they communicated changes to local boards of health around the cost-sharing model. Again, the April 11th announcement provided no details. Details started to emerge thereafter. The first opportunity for that was April 18th. And you'll see the changes or the specific nature of the cost-sharing changes as shown here on this slide. And what I would like to call your attention to is that first, there was a retroactive nature to the changes that were proposed by the provincial government. This was an announcement made on April 18th, and you'll see the changes dated back to April the 1st. And I think also of note was the fact that there was a proposal for a different and unique cost-sharing arrangement for the City of Toronto, where we were the only jurisdiction that was being asked or proposed to go to a 50-50 cost-sharing model from the 75-25 that had been the tradition for a number of years. Moving then to May 27th, we're still on the recap. The Premier held a televised press conference and made some announcements which were characterized as a reprieve on the retroactive nature to the change in the cost-sharing model. And there was communication specifically received by the City of Toronto in which the Premier indicated that this reprieve would allow for the opportunity for municipalities, and Toronto in particular, to work with the province to transform certain critical public services and find efficiencies that would sustain sustainability on an ongoing basis. Unfortunately, very little by way of detail outside of what I just described on the last slide was provided in that May 27th announcement. And we have continued to reach out to colleagues at the provincial government and at the Ministry of Health in particular to get more details. But there are still a number of items that I feel we need to negotiate or at the very least confirm with our provincial partners. And those things are, we need to confirm one, or negotiate the funding envelope, the specific funding envelope for us as Toronto Public Health for 2019, for 2020, and for 2021. I would like to also ensure that we have a better understanding of the cost-sharing model, the cost-sharing ratio. What are those figures going to be, particularly for 2020 and for 2021, which is the year in which the provincial government had proposed that we go to that 50-50 model, the unique and different cost-sharing ratio specifically for Toronto. And finally, what proportion of the $200 million in savings that is expected to be affected for the entire public health system in the province, what proportion of that savings is meant to be achieved by us, Toronto Public Health? These are things I think that need to yet be sorted through. In addition to the May 27th announcement, there have been some other developments that affect us directly at Toronto Public Health. For starters, we have received a funding letter which indicates that the amount that we should expect to receive for Toronto Public Health, specifically for the low-income seniors dental program that the province announced, is for 2019-2020, the funding that we should expect to receive is $15,543,300. The province is currently holding information sessions with the various public health units and who will ultimately be the providers and administrators of this service, but specific details of the program have yet to be provided in those information sessions. I think it's important for the board to note that what will be especially interesting and important for us to know is what exactly is contained in that basket of services, right? And what are the terms under which those services might be provided to low-income seniors. This gives you a sense as to, one, what you can expect for clients who seek to access the program, and two, how much service might actually be delivered as a result of this funding announcement. What we do know to date thus far is that seniors can obtain services from any public health area. They are not restricted to receiving services under this low-income seniors dental program within their own home jurisdiction or their home community. And the expectation is that local public health will be coordinating with community health centers and with Aboriginal health access centers in delivery of the program. Now, if we could go to the next slide. I thought it was worth actually having a bit of a conversation here in respect of governance. There were some questions and some discussion that arose at the most recent Board of Health Budget Committee meeting, and I think those questions made it clear in my mind that we should have some conversation, particularly because we have a number of new members here at the Board of Health table, that it would be useful to make sure that there is a common understanding of the roles and responsibilities of the Board of Health, what my role and responsibility is as the Medical Officer of Health in respect of budget issues, the role of City Council, and how these roles and responsibilities manifest themselves in respect of Toronto Public Health programs, services, and ultimately our budget. So Just by way of, and again, this is not meant to be a comprehensive discussion on governance. I will not belabor the point, just to provide you with a high-level summary. First and foremost, the Board of Health is governed by the Health Protection and Promotion Act and its regulations, and as well by the City of Toronto Act and all the bylaws that come associated with that. Just to remind the members of the Board of Health, the Health Protection and Promotion Act states that the Act provides for, and I quote, the organization and delivery of public health programs and services, the prevention of the spread of disease, and the promotion and protection of the health of the people of Ontario. How this interfaces with the City of Toronto Act? Well, the City of Toronto Act establishes the Board of Health, provides for establishing the size and appointments to the Board of Health, and describes the function of City Council in respect to myself as the Medical Officer of Health, provides resources to the Board in order to fulfill its duties under the Health Protection and Promotion Act, which I just described to you earlier, and City Council also plays an important role in terms of appointing the Board's auditor. So when we try to look at these things all put together, the Board of Health is ultimately held accountable by the province to provide programs and services as prescribed by the Health Protection and Promotion Act. And that act itself is further supplemented by the Ontario Public Health Standards and its associated protocols. I think it's important for you to note as well that the Board of Health does have authority under the Health Protection and Promotion Act, and it's Section 9 of that act in particular, that allows for the Board to provide for optional programs and services, which would be characterized as health programs or services that the Board of Health feels, in their opinion, would be necessary or desirable in order to serve the needs of people within the health unit that's served by the Board of Health. And it also has to be the case that in order to provide those optional programs and services, that City Council approve the provision of that health program or service. And again, just to highlight what my role is and what my responsibilities are in respect of all this work that we need to do, given that budget is an important conversation, or a particularly important conversation for us this year. As Medical Officer of Health, I have a bit of a dual role here. First and foremost, I have to report to you as the board on issues related to public health concerns and how best to address those particular concerns, bringing to bear the best available evidence on how to address those issues. I also have a role in executing a fiduciary responsibility regarding the funding provided by the province and the city in terms of the delivery of public health programs and services. So taking us through to the next slide, I think it addresses some of the issues that Director McKelvey raised in a question on an earlier agenda item, a little bit about the Board of Health budget process and how it actually works, and how our deliberations here at this table impact the Toronto Public Health budget and how that actually comes into being. This basically takes you through a high-level summary of the Board of Health budget process. And as you see, it starts off with the recommended budget that we put forward to the Board of Health Budget Committee. This is made by, it's a budget that's put together by Toronto Public Health staff with significant input from our senior management team at Toronto Public Health. We bring that forward to the Board of Health Budget Committee, who has the opportunity to review that recommended budget, provide advice to me in respect of that recommended budget, and has the opportunity to then recommend in whole or in part that budget to the rest of the Board of Health. The Board of Health then will receive a budget brought forward by me at a Board of Health meeting, and the Board of Health then has the opportunity to once again review that budget, consider the Budget Committee's recommendations, and then recommend in whole or in part the budget, which then in turn goes through the city's budget process. So effectively what happens is that at the end of the Board of Health process, the board recommends a complete operating budget with staffing complement and a capital budget, and that has to go through the city's budget process. I should point out that while service levels are discussed, and this was part of the discussion that we had at last week's Board of Health Budget Committee meeting, hence I'm bringing it forward to this whole table, service levels are discussed as part of the budget process. But it's interesting in that they're typically only discussed in the context of new and enhanced services, new or enhanced services more appropriately, or proposed reductions to services. So there are service levels for those of you who've not yet had the pleasure of going through one of these budget processes. There are service levels that are described in the budget analyst notes. I should advise you, though, that they are not entirely exhaustive in terms of what's covered, and they're not exhaustive in terms of all the programs and services that Toronto Public Health provides. If you want to see a more detailed set of service levels or service level expectations and indicators, that would be characterized and can be found in the Ontario Public Health Standards and its protocols. They get quite granular and quite into the details around what is anticipated and expected of local public health delivery. So what that means is that we have this range of service indicators and expectations, sometimes very detailed, sometimes very high level when you look at the budget documentation and that which you're approving, whether you're a member of the Board of Health Budget Committee or the Board of Health. And when I say approving, it's recommending then to the next level of the budget process. I think what happens even within the context of the Ontario Public Health Standards and the protocols, they too are sometimes extremely detailed and sometimes a little higher level in respect of what the service level indicators are or service level expectations might look like. And what this allows for is that it allows for local public health jurisdictions, each local public health agency, to determine what makes the most sense within their context. It gives them latitude in how programs and services are delivered and how service expectations and indicators are achieved. So the simplest way for me to describe this in a very concise way is to say that, say for example, we have a program that has traditionally taken 10 FTEs or 20 FTEs to deliver. Let's use the number 20. If in fact we have a new technology that then allows for a smaller number of FTEs to deliver that program, then by having general service level expectations and indicators, we're afforded the opportunity to do what makes most sense, to continue to deliver the program, but to take the resources that might have been used before in a more manual process that have now been more automated as a result of new technology, reduce the FTE complement there, and then provide the resources in another area that actually addresses public health needs of the population. So moving now through to the City of Toronto budget process. The city's budget process has 3 stages, and they're outlined here on the slide. Important for the Board of Health members to know that while there is this very delineated process, the budget put forward by the Board of Health can be changed at any given time in the process. City Council ultimately holds the authority and has the opportunity and responsibility for approving the operating budget, the staffing complement, and the capital budget for Toronto Public Health. Just to give you a little more detail on that, Council's approval of the operating budget includes 3 components: the gross operating amount, the net operating amount at a program level, and the staffing complement. So the room has gotten very quiet. Walking through a budget process tends to do that.
I'm fascinated.
Thank you, Director Perks. I appreciate that. But I think you might be in the minority. Most people tend not to be particularly fascinated by budget processes. So now let's make it a little more real and a little less theoretical as we turn to our financial pressures. So what we have here in terms of financial pressures. These are the financial pressures that we know we face as a result of the April budget. and the subsequent announcements that have been made by our provincial partners. The last written information that we have from the Ministry of Health regarding the 2019 funding envelope is that the amount is $190 million. We have asked the Ministry of Health to confirm this after the May 27th announcement was made by the Premier, but we have regrettably not been able to do so until this so far. But we are continuing to make asks of our provincial colleagues. So working then on the last available information, we know that we have an estimated, as indicated on the slide, $4 million financial pressure based on the budget that was approved by City Council earlier in this year. So now turning to the 2020 financial pressures, this is again based on the last written communication that we have. And looking forward to the 2020 financial pressure, that's estimated to be in the range of $19 million to $70 million for 2020. As you can see here delineated on the slide, the city will actually need to increase its investment in public health from $43 million to $63 million if it is to be able to maintain a $170 million funding envelope at a 60-40 cost-sharing model. So that is quite sobering, I think, for all of us. It certainly is for those of us at Toronto Public Health. But in order for you as a board to understand how we develop particular strategies in order to deal with these pressures and what sorts of actions we might take over and above understanding what the budget process is, I think it's important for you to know what actually goes into our Toronto Public Health budget. What exactly is it comprised of? So if we look at the specifics of Toronto Public Health's operating budget, as you can see, the majority of that which is put into our budget actually goes to salaries and benefits. We are not a particularly capital-heavy environment or business. We are an agency that conducts its functions through people, through professional staff. So that accounts for a significant proportion, and as you see here on the slide, it's roughly 75% of our budget. About 20% of our budget it goes towards non-payroll expenses, and there are some subcategories broken out for you on the slides. We have contracted services delivered by community agencies comprising about 8%, 6% going to grants like the student nutrition programs, and finally at the bottom of the slide, we've got about 5% of our operating budget going towards support services that allow us to run our business at Toronto Public Health. Things like facilities, like legal services, information technology, human resources, all the support services that are required to actually make an organization, a public health agency, run. So what does that mean in terms of strategies for us at Toronto Public Health? Well, for 2019, what we are doing thus far is holding, not surprisingly, on discretionary expenditures, some of which are listed here on the slide. This, I think, is a reasonable step to take within the context of an uncertain financial picture, and we know that we have pressures. We still have yet to hear, as I mentioned earlier, from our provincial partners, some confirmation around what we believe to be the case. We're also looking at how we can manage the pressure through managing our existing resources, and we know that we have a significant amount of attrition as part of our workforce complement, and this occurs naturally. So what we're trying to do is look at different strategies, including attrition, such that we're able to manage the financial pressures, but in a way that doesn't negatively impact on the health status of the people that we serve. This is fundamentally, serving the people of Toronto and protecting and promoting their health status is the fundamental of the business. Hence, we're trying to do everything we can to meet the financial pressures, to address the financial pressures, but in a way that doesn't impact negatively on the health status of Torontonians. Things get a little more complicated as the financial pressures become more significant. And as I mentioned to you earlier in this presentation, that starts to happen around 2020. We get more financial pressure, as already described to you in this presentation. Right? That financial pressure in 2020 is in the range of, again, $19 million to $70 million. These are significant figures for us at Toronto Public Health. And as a result, the kind of financial pressure we're speaking of is significant. So we are developing strategies and options on how this pressure could be addressed. We had some opportunity to discuss that at the most recent Board of Health Budget Committee meeting. But I did want to take the opportunity to provide the broader board with a sense as to what strategies are currently under consideration. And this is just a high-level overview. You know, the plan is not to get into details at this stage of the game at this forum. However, I did want the board to know that there are some strategies that we're thinking through, and I wanted to take you through a high-level summary on each of these. Specific details on each of these strategies and options will be provided to the Board of Health Budget Committee as part of the 2020 budget process and at the subsequent Board of Health Budget Committee, which occurs in September. So turning now to the high-level summary on the strategies that we're seeking to deploy to manage the financial pressures on the go-forward basis. As I mentioned to you earlier, we have a provincial low-income seniors dental program announcement with some dollars attached to it. Details still, as I mentioned earlier, being fleshed out. We don't have very much by way of detail, don't know what the basket of services is, still don't have many of the terms of engagement for clients and terms of eligibility. So we can't really speak to how much specifically we might be able to obtain through this funding stream. However, we do know that we have had 100% city budget for a low-income seniors dental program, and the funding for this new program certainly provides for the opportunity for the reinvestment of those dollars into other public health programs. As you can see on the slide, without knowing any of the details or the specific details of the program, right now we're imagining that there might be a savings estimate in the $4 to $6 million range annually, and reinvesting these savings into other Toronto public health programs would reduce the financial pressure on public health by an estimated $8 to $15 million, depending on what ultimately is the change to the provincial municipal cost-sharing arrangement. So this provides one venue, one avenue by which we can manage our financial pressures. Looking at some other strategies, we are considering new revenue sources. I think we have an opportunity to identify new revenue sources and to think about revenues where we haven't traditionally, or charging where we haven't traditionally charged. Whether we're talking about charging for re-inspections or other services that we currently provide, we do need to look at new and potential revenue sources on a go-forward basis. We also know that there is a provincial technical table that is to be set up very shortly. We have been in contact with our provincial colleagues on this provincial technical table. A short version of the story is that the Ministry of Health has indicated its intent to form a City of Toronto Public Health Technical Table, where we will be provided with an opportunity, a venue, as TPH officials and with some colleagues from the city, to provide expertise and advice to the Ministry of Health as they seek to, and I'm using their terms, quote, modernize public health in the province. So we have an opportunity, I think, to discuss a number of things, everything from funding to programs to service level expectations to changes to the Ontario Public Health Standards, as indicated here on the slide. I think there are certain standards and protocols that we can argue don't really meet the needs of Torontonians as well as others might. And I think there's an opportunity to divest ourselves of certain areas of activity that frankly don't deliver on public health needs. I think we have an opportunity to discuss with our provincial counterparts the introduction of new information systems that actually allow us to gain some administrative efficiencies. None of these are short-term or quick turnaround endeavors, but I think we would be remiss if we didn't take that opportunity. I think we can also do such things as negotiate some funding around functions that have been downloaded either directly from the province or from the federal government to the province to us in turn. There are activities that fall within that basket, and I think we have an opportunity to negotiate funding on items such as that. And that's, again, just to give you a little bit of a flavor of the opportunity that presents itself at the provincial technical table, and that would also meet or help us to meet some of the financial pressures we foresee in 2020 and beyond. Finally, there are another bucket of other strategies that are currently under development in order to address the financial pressures that we see coming in 2020 and beyond. There was an organizational review that we conducted at Toronto Public Health at the behest of City Council as part of its 2017 budget process. It was one of the recommendations that Council had asked for Toronto Public Health to undertake. We completed that organizational review at the end of last year, but did not have the opportunity to implement it. We could consider implementing select recommendations from that, again, as a means by which to address financial pressures. We are certainly looking at proposed changes to our programs and services, whether we're looking at the effectiveness of those programs or changing the method by which we deliver some of these services in order to address our financial pressures. I think these are some other methods by which we can seek to manage, again, very significant financial pressures for 2020 and beyond. We are actively collaborating with the Association of Local Public Health Agencies and the Council of Medical Officers of Health of Ontario. We are not the only local public health agency that is dealing with these pressures. We have unique circumstances. I told you that we were advised, or what has been proposed by the province is a different and unique cost-sharing model for the City of Toronto. So we do have a unique circumstances that other local public health agencies, quite frankly, are not dealing with. They have some other challenges that we in turn are not dealing with. They are far more affected by the provincial proposal regarding regionalization and creating new public health entities. That is not top of mind for us. However, we do see opportunities, and we are taking advantage of opportunities to collaborate with other local public health agencies and practitioners to address what's been put forth by our provincial colleagues. So we will report back in September, as I mentioned earlier, with options for the board's consideration. They will go through the Board of Health Budget Committee, then subsequently, as through the standard process, come here to the Board of Health, and then will be entered through the regular city's budget process, which I just described to you earlier. So with that ends the presentation. I would be very pleased to take any questions or address any questions or concerns that any of the board members may have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And just before we move into questions, we have had a member of the public who arrived. We had moved inside with a request to depute. I'm gonna suggest, given that somebody has come down with a request to depute, that we move out of this closed session to open it up for deputations, if that's all right with members of the committee. Okay. So we have just Mark Harris. Mark, you'll have 5 minutes. You can have a seat. There's a clock on my right, and I'll begin it.
I'm Mark Harris. I'm a healthcare professional lobbyist. I work in construction as a shop steward with the local 27 union. And there's a lot of bad work going on in TCHC homes with asbestos and insulation. And in my neighborhood, in this building, have about 4 babies that is 10 years old. And any building that is over 50 years old has asbestos in it. Plus, after 50 years old, it builds up fungus.
So, Mark, I'm afraid, I don't mean to interrupt, but the item we're dealing with here that you're deputing on is the Board of Health budget submission. So if you'd like to keep your comments to the Board of Health budget, we'd be happy to have a conversation if you have comments not related to the budget.
Talk, but I made a proposal in 2014 to take the sewage out of the lake, and now they're doing it, and now you can offset the costs because it's less chemical would be used, so you can offset the cost with putting into other parts of the budget. That's all I have to say. But you'll be saving chemicals in treating the sewage from the drinking water. If you take the sewage out, it's less chemicals used.
Okay. Thank you. Are there any?
And another thing too, you're doing a good job with cleaning up the buildings with the garbage, but you guys should come around more often with spray cans to spray these bins.
Okay.
Or at least the superintendents can do it.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Harris. Are there any questions of the deputant? Okay. Seeing none. Thank you very much.
Can I speak to you after though?
We're now going to move this back into committee with questions. I have Director Lai.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I first wanted to thank staff for really providing us with a very good report, and I actually have most of my questions answered by the presentation, but I do have a few questions here. We do have the Toronto Board of Health have a senior dental program, is that correct?
I'm sorry. Seniors dental.
The Board of Health has a seniors dental program.
So through the chair, that's correct. We have a low-income seniors dental
Yeah,
program.
low-income seniors dental program. And what is the 2019 budget in terms of the funding for this program?
So through the chair, I'm just going to refer back to my finance director. It's in the neighborhood of about $6 million.
About $6
million.
About $6 million? Okay, thank you. Through the chair, you know, the province low-income seniors dental program, they have allocated approximately $15.5 million funding for Toronto for the year 2019 to 2020. Has this program kicked off yet? Do you have an idea whether this program has kicked off or not?
So through the chair, no, it has not. And in fact, as I mentioned in the presentation, we are still awaiting details in respect of what's included. So what services are included in the program? So they're hoping to get, my understanding is that the intent of the provincial government is to launch the program late summer, early fall.
So that is the indication you're being advised.
Through the chair, that's what we've got so far. However, I will call the attention of the Board of Health members to the fact that it is July the 8th today, and we have yet to hear details of what's included in the basket of services.
And so that means that the $6 million we have budgeted, that, you know, really we probably will be spending it for the programs, that is existing program that we're having in the Toronto program. Is that correct?
So through the chair, yes for now, but again, we have the opportunity, again, pending what the specifics are of the provincial low-income seniors dental program, to then move costs over such that they're covered by the provincial basket of funding, which then liberates dollars that would have been assigned to the city's program to other public health programs. That was the point that I was trying to get at in respect of the financial strategy to reduce, or one of the strategies, excuse me, to reduce pressures on our current budget.
So does that mean that the $800,000 sort of gap that we have, we can actually fill that with some of these money in there? Would it be a fair statement for that?
So through the chair, I think it's a possibility. It would be helpful to understand the specifics. There are many conversations that are happening right now between our staff that oversee our dental and oral health programs and with the provincial counterparts who are establishing the provincial low-income seniors dental program. We're hopeful that we'll be able to manage some of it. How much will depend, it's always, as they say, the devil is in the details.
Okay, I guess, thank you very much. And I guess my last question would be, do you have any idea as to the timeline of this Toronto technical table that they're going to form? And any idea when this is going to, when we can actually, this table is going to be formed so that we can deliver all our comments to them?
So through the chair, I was in active conversation and communication, I guess I should say more accurately, with colleagues from the Ministry of Health last week. We are hoping to get that table up and running as soon as possible.
So there's no definite timeline?
Well, it actually, as I understand it, they're hoping to wrap up the table by the mid-fall, September, October timeframe right now. So clearly, the table has to start meeting soon.
So my last question would be, if there's a table, who would be sitting in that table?
So through the chair, that's still under negotiation. However, the invitation was extended to the City of Toronto City Manager, and he has assigned me as the lead for the city.
So just one person at that table?
No, that's through the chair. That's still under negotiation. The expectation is that we will bring some members from Toronto Public Health and the city, and that the province would bring their own members to the table. But we're going to try to keep it fairly well circumscribed as the timelines are tight.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I have Jennifer McKelvey, then Gord Perks, and then Stephanie Donaldson.
Thank you. Can you put slide 12 back on the screen from your presentation? Okay. So yeah, you can turn to it. So while they're finding it, I just want to make sure I'm understanding the math on the first one where you say the 19 million if the province caps the funding at 170. And then you go on and it says, and the city increases its contribution to public health. So I just want to be clear, that's 20 million. So if the city puts in an additional 20 million, you hit your 170 cap, and then you still have a 19 shortfall. So really, the pressure on the city is 39 million.
So let me just get to our numbers. So we're up on slide
12.
12. Let me make sure I've got it. Yes. Okay, so this is the slide that actually indicates that the 2020 financial pressure ranges from 19 million to 70 million for 2020. So it's at 19 million if the province caps the total funding envelope at $170 million starting April 1st, 2020. And the city increases its contribution to public health to maximize the 170 million provincial cap. So I'm just, because we're still working on getting this.
So the city needs to increase their contribution by 20 million to maximize the 170 million, and then you still have a 19 million shortfall.
If it's at a 60-40 cost-sharing model.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so then the pressure, there's 19 million that's pressure to you, but really the pressure, if you look at it cumulatively on the city, is 39.
That's correct.
Okay. And then I just want to confirm again, following on Director Lai's comments, questions, the only new money that is coming forward is for seniors dental. There was no other new programs or funding streams that were brought forward.
Through the chair, just to be clear, you mean from the province?
From the province.
That is correct.
Okay. And then as you're sitting down and going through this and thinking about this pressure and how to deal with it, like how do you have your programs ranked? Do you have your programs ranked in terms of, must-haves, nice-to-haves, contribute, but like, do you know like what absolutely must be protected versus what we might be able to find other funding sources for example, or could offset, delay, et cetera?
So through the chair, throughout the Ontario Public Health Standards and its associated protocols, the language varies from section to section. There are some areas that suggest that we must. There are some areas that suggest that we should insure or shall insure. So it does vary from service to service. That was the point that I was trying to get at, where there are service levels, expectations that are sometimes extremely granular and well delineated, and others that offer a little more latitude. In conversation with our provincial partners at the Ministry of Health, they changed the Ontario Public Health Standards in 2018. And what's interesting about that is that their document actually speaks to the foundational standards as being the most fundamental. These are the ones that actually speak about population health assessment, understanding the needs of the population, and then applying evidence, the best available evidence, in order to address the public health needs. It's interesting because at the end of the day, there is a uniform set of Ontario public health standards and protocols that's actually prescribed for the entire province. But in fact, we know the circumstances in Toronto are going to be quite different from that in Ottawa or London or Thunder Bay or, you know, you can think of the many other municipalities throughout the province. So, you know, I think that that's where we're interested in having serious conversation at the City of Toronto Public Health Technical Table to try to see how much latitude we're able to get, and specifically, you know, have our provincial counterparts appreciate and understand what makes sense for Toronto, what actually addresses the public health needs of Torontonians, how that might differ relative to what's important and what addresses the needs of populations elsewhere, and how we can actually come up with something and live within our financial means, whatever those turn out to be.
And in terms of the strategies in preparing, and I realize there's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know exactly what the cut will be, but we're pretty sure there'll be something. Is there strategies to engage with both the federal government, but also like private sector to look at like corporate donate? Like, are there programs that might be very amenable to like corporate sponsorships, for example? And are we laying that out for, you know, a plan B or a plan C so that we can ensure that we're still delivering these programs?
So through the chair, we have some opportunities to engage with the federal government, but I would say that largely, as is the case with most programs within the Ministry of Health, they are under the purview of the province. Right. So there are some opportunities. I spoke to you of one at a very high level. There are certain programs that are downloaded from the feds to the province and in turn to us. Tuberculosis screening would be a classic example of that. Is there an opportunity to engage with our provincial counterparts and our federal counterparts to see about a change in the funding model or a support model to better allow for that service to continue? I think we do have that opportunity. So certainly open to that. I would also suggest to you that we do have conversations with the Toronto Office for Partnerships around, you know, what opportunities exist to engage the private sector. It, of course, has a number of pitfalls associated with it that we would have to address very carefully. But certainly we are looking at, what I provided you was a high-level summary of strategies that we're looking at. It is by no means an exhaustive list of all the strategies. In fact, we're still working our way through what other opportunities might exist to address the pressures, because they are significant. Whether it's on the low end of that range or the high end, these are big, these are, you know, they're significant numbers.
Okay. Thank you and good luck.
Director Pertz. You're up.
Thank you, Cruise Director Cressy. So first, if I could, looking at slide 6, the final bullet point, the city manager to lead a value-based outcome review as part of the 2020 budget process. I'm not recalling what that is. What is that?
Through the chair, once I know, I will be sure to let the Board of Health know. We are relative, because we're one of the agencies, boards, and commissions, we actually haven't engaged in the process yet. I understand that we are on the docket, but the other city divisions are up first. So I will give you my best understanding of what I believe the process to be. I understand that there are external consultants that have been brought on board by the city. This was in response to the provincial announcement. You might recall that, and I'm trying to remember which particular announcement there was.
Oh, it's
Is
the
that,
audit. It's the audit.
yes. So this is the opportunity to examine the books,
An opportunity
if you will.
for us to pay KPMG again. Okay.
But, well, if I may, Mr. Chair, I think it might be the province that's paying.
It's an opportunity for them to pay KPMG again. Okay. All right. Now I understand what that is. I'm not so worried anymore. have you received, typically by this point in the budget process, there's either been a council direction or a city manager direction that goes out to all divisions and agencies, laying out the budgetary goals. I know that council hasn't done one, and I've not been made aware of anything from the city manager. Have you received any guidelines, directions, a memo that sets a spending goal, a service level goal, that prescribes a capital spending limit, or anything like that from the city at all?
So through the chair, I have not personally. I am going to look at my Director of Finance and Administration to see if through her channels she has received anything.
So through the chair, I have also not received anything for the upcoming budget process.
Well, that's the first time in 12 years that that's been the case at this point in the budget process. Okay. Going to slide 14. When you were reading through this slide, in the narrative you said, or when you were talking, you said something about attrition as being a discretionary expenditure control, but it doesn't appear here. So does that mean that we're currently employing, not backfilling vacant positions through attrition as a cost containment method?
So through the chair, it depends on what the circumstances are. There are certain programs where we simply we cannot provide the service and meet our obligations without refilling. There are other positions where we're able to stretch and still cover our obligations without necessarily filling the positions in the immediate term.
And that's for 2019?
Through the chair, that is correct.
So my understanding, and this is from years of experience of being on the Board of Health, is that it is not within your authority to reduce the complement that was approved by Toronto City Council and this board without direction from us. You can do it on an emergency basis between meetings. Are you bringing to us a request to implement a strategy to reduce the complement that Council and this board funded you for?
So through the chair, your understanding of complement is, from what I have gathered, I did a little bit of work into this, I understand that that is not the case. Our obligation is towards providing, meeting the needs of the population. Sometimes that includes very specific service level obligations. So for example, if we have a program that has traditionally been provided for by a certain number of full-time equivalents, and we're able to introduce a technology that allows for greater efficiency, we may still then be able to, right? We would not continue to have the same number of FTEs providing that service.
Right.
We do have the resources, so we might use those resources, deploy those resources in a manner that still meets our obligations to public health, but not necessarily to that program.
So when Toronto City Council approves its budget, it approves a net number, a gross number, and a complement number, and directs that you implement the services based on that. Every other division, agency, board, or commission that wants to change that partway through the year brings something through the City of Toronto Budget Committee requesting a variance to that, mid-year variance. Is it your intention to bring a mid-year variance to change the spending or the complement that was approved by Toronto City Council and the Board of Health?
So through the chair, it's, if I can, on this notion of how much we have approved in terms of complement and how much we actually have on board at any one given time, I'm just going to look at my numbers because I don't want to misspeak. And I will ask my Director of Finance and Administration to correct me should I misspeak. But my understanding is, for example, we have an approved staffing complement of approximately 1,800, 1,850. And I don't know the exact number. I don't know, Althea, if you have the exact number available to you. But at any point in the year, we have an average that looks more like about 1,750 staff, FTE complement on hand. So while there is a specific number that's approved as part of the budget process, in fact, and I don't think this is unique to Toronto Public Health, the actual number that are available on hand will differ from the technically approved complement. The obligation, as I understand it, is to meet the service level and to meet the needs and obligations that we set out as part of the budget. So there is latitude with respect to managing the FTE and the complement. If we are to significantly make changes in respect of a program area, which then has specific complement implications, given that we are a 75% staffing and benefit type organization, clearly we would bring that forward to this table. However, changes that are around, changes that allow us to meet certain financial pressures, but still allow us to meet the obligations to the population, as I understand, do not need, we may come and inform you, but they do not necessarily require the approval of the board. That's my understanding of how the process works, but be very happy to discuss further.
We're just over 7 minutes.
Okay, I'd like
Want
a
to
second round when we have time.
Okay. I have Director Donaldson.
Thanks, through your chair. Just one very quick question. I'm trying to get a handle on what Toronto Public Health is dealing with versus other public health units across the province. So are we the only ones that have a low-income seniors dental program, or is that in other units as well?
So through the chair, just to be clear, do you mean an existing municipally funded?
Yeah.
So no, there are other jurisdictions. I know, for example, that just to the west of us, Peel Region has one. I believe Halton may also have one, but I off the top of my head, I can't remember all the different jurisdictions that currently have a low-income seniors program.
But not all of them?
Not all of them.
Okay.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? I have some before I'll open it up for a second round if there's a request. Any other questions? Okay. So I just want for all of our benefit, the Board of Health Budget Committee is meeting in September, and then we'll be bringing a recommendation to this board when? Which meeting is it that this board will next consider the budget?
Sorry, I'm going to, through the chair, I'm going to have to refer, what is, the next meeting is October?
It's in October.
Yes, the meeting after, there is I believe, early to mid-October meeting of the board.
October 21st, I've heard from clerks. So when will this board be submitting our final, when is this board expected to submit our final budget to the city manager?
So through you, Mr. Chair, I think the budget process for the 2020 budget process is definitely different this year. Director Perks brings up an important point in his comments. I don't have the exact dates, but my sense is that in order to meet the timelines, it will likely either be the October or the November meetings.
Okay, so
We can, we'll have to take that offline and confirm for you, as the budget process is still very much in development.
so is the current expectation, because some of the uncertainty related to our provincial share, is the current expectation that at that October Board of Health meeting is when we will be asked to endorse a final budget to present to city manager? Is that the current working plan that may change based on the province?
That's correct. It would be either October, and if we have, depending on what the city's process was, we might have the opportunity to push it out to November.
Okay, so in October or November is when this board will be making a final decision. Okay. The Board of Health Budget Committee, and so in the supplementary report that members of this board will have received on Friday, our Board of Health Budget Committee made some recommendations that this board will then be asked to endorse. I will have a motion to that effect, which was directing or requesting you, Dr. Davila, to bring forward options for any savings that don't negatively impact population health, as well as revenue options. And so that will be coming forward to September to the Board of Health Budget Committee and then this board in October. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. There was also a request, and you alluded to it in your one of your last slides, around conversations with other medical officers of health and the Association of Public Health Agencies. There was also a request from the Board of Health Budget Committee for an update on the status of conversations you are having with other medical officers of health related to an alternative provincial restructuring proposal. Do we have an update on that?
So through you, Mr. Chair, I can provide you a high-level update at this stage of the game. We are, as I said, I've been actively engaging with members of, for example, the Association of Local Public Health Agencies and with the members of the Council of Medical Officers of Health of Ontario. We are working through some processes and trying to propose a model that we can put forward to the Chief Medical Officer of Health, and that he in turn can share with the Minister of Health and others within the provincial government. I think that for this forum, it's probably best if I left it at that, and perhaps we might take that offline.
Okay, those are all my questions. There's been a request for a second round. For a second round of questions, Director Perks?
I can't take it. Just call me Gord.
Gord.
So I want to understand this a little bit more clearly. I meant to go and get the actual council direction, but I didn't have time to find it. My understanding of the practice has always been that, yes, we do have gapping because people leave jobs and you need to move people around and so on. But any decision to reduce the staffing in a program area for any reason on a permanent basis requires direction from this board. Is that your understanding?
Through the chair, that is, again, if it's a significant reduction, yes. However, my understanding is that certain latitude is given to particular smaller reductions that effectively allow us to continue to deliver the service and to meet our obligations, that those do not necessarily require approval. They would be, as long as we're following appropriate HR policy, labor relation policy, labor law, and we're delivering on the service, meeting the obligation, that would be something that we could we would advise and appropriately advise the board of, but not necessarily seek approval for.
Okay. So this process of attrition that you've described is not Board of Health wide, not Toronto Public Health wide. You're not doing it for, so this conversation grew out of a statement you made about responses to date, holding on discretionary expenditures.
Correct.
You mentioned attrition as one of the ways that you're doing that. You have not implemented attrition or not backfilling vacant positions public health wide. You're not doing it across the whole of Toronto Public Health.
So through the chair, that's an interesting and difficult question to answer, because by its very nature, attrition happens where it happens. What we need to do, though, as a matter of exercising the fiduciary role that I have in both its components, I spoke about ensuring that we meet the obligations to the board and that the board has under the Health Protection and Promotion Act. And I also spoke about the role and responsibility that we share in respect of staying within the existing financial envelope and ensuring that we're executing or using the resources responsibly and appropriately.
Yes.
So in so doing, we may have attrition that comes up, retirements. We do have we have a very proud history of keeping staff for a very long period of time. We're at a stage where we're seeing many of our colleagues deciding to move on to the next chapter. Depending on what the role is and where that role occurs and what service it provides and whether we have other resources by which to provide that service, other existing human resources, or technologies that can augment the existing resources we have, we will have to make the decision, as we would as responsible custodians of the dollars, to determine what is the best way to make sure that we protect public health, that we achieve our objectives, that we meet our service obligations within the existing resource envelope. Right. So is it across the Toronto Public Health? It depends on where the vacancies pop up And if it's in an area that requires an individual to provide a specific service, we will try to do so within the existing resources.
So I need to draw a further distinction then. So there's a difference between gapping, which is managing temporary vacancies where someone may retire or be on a mat leave or have left their job for other reasons, and taking some time and filling that back. That period is the gap.
Mm-hmm.
There's a difference between that and the administration, not the board, taking a decision that unless there is some compelling reason, we will never backfill positions. I'm trying to understand what the administration of public health is actually doing at this time. Could you explain it to me with the distinction between gapping and not filling positions in mind?
So through the chair, what we're trying to do is determine as positions become available, how do we best fulfill our obligations? And this is part of our operations. That's why you hire us to manage, and me in particular, to manage the business. What we're trying to do is make sure that we meet the obligations that we have set ourselves up for, that we have, that we're able to discharge our obligations under the Ontario Public Health Standards and its protocols, so that you in turn, as the Board of Health, can assure yourselves that you have discharged your responsibilities under the Health Protection and Promotion Act. What that means is that if we have vacancies available or vacancies come up, we are actually, as a senior team, looking through what service does it provide? Do we have the means by which to do it? Does it require refilling, either from an internal, using existing resources, or are we in a position where we have to go externally? We're doing all of these things, frankly, on a case-by-case basis, because we feel that we have to, given our current financial pressures. We will not be able to meet the financial pressures if we don't consistently and regularly look at all the specific positions, see if there's a way for us to address those needs without having to rehire, to make use of existing resources, whether it's augmented by technology or otherwise.
Thank you. Any other questions in the second round? Okay, we're going to move into speakers then. Anybody to speak? I'm happy to, Councillor or Director Lai.
Thank you, Director and Chair Cressy. I've listened, and this is the first year sitting on the Board of Health. I've got a lot to learn, as I've told the chair, and I've come to for this recommendation here that we should not be budget. I mean, for the next year's budget, we do not. We'll look for options for savings that will not negatively impact the health status of Torontonians. This is a very, very good goal, and I just wanted to add a couple of things that I like the expression modernizing our public health system or public health programs, because sometimes status quo, may not work, or it may not be the best thing moving forward, and we need to modernize the whole system. And that means we should be looking for efficiencies or maybe any duplication of services, and where we can find something to fill in the gaps and all that. And I just maybe when staff are going to explore all these options, and I just wanted to maybe add some things that I wanted to bring forward is that maybe we should explore ways of some collaboration. And let me give you an example. Perhaps the student breakfast program, and there might be people out there from the private sector who might be able to kind of share this burden or share this goal. And I don't know. I mean, it's just that a suggestion, and I'm very, very hopeful that, and I hope that the staff would balance the budget this year. But I certainly hope that we will be able to be proactive and looking forward. That we should be very, very, we should look for the the positive impact and the positive side of things for healthcare status of the Torontonians. Thank you.
Next to speak, Director Perks.
Sounds so silly. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So I'm deeply concerned about the issue that we've been dialoguing on, having to do with not backfilling vacant positions. The process by which we develop budgets is, the MOH referred to it lightly as something that maybe puts people to sleep, and I understand that. I've served on the City of Toronto's Budget Committee during the global financial crisis, and suddenly everybody woke up and paid a lot of awfully close attention. And in fact, we were getting at that point weekly updates on the size of the population that had moved on to Ontario Works and had lost their jobs. And of course, whenever that happened, the cost of the city was going up. And we had no idea where the bottom was. You'd open your newspaper every day, or I guess go on the internet to get your news, and you'd find out that somewhere else in the world another bank had failed. And we had no idea where the bottom was. So the city manager at the time distributed a memo and saying that he was implementing a hiring freeze across the corporation, and he had directed agencies, boards, and commissions to follow that. It then was put forward to council, where we endorsed it. And we knew that that would have service level impacts, and in the process of doing that, we sort of red circled an amount of money and certain kinds of work that in that time of crisis we knew were not going to be touched. We made sure that the most vulnerable in our society weren't the ones losing services as a result of that hiring freeze. It was a painful and difficult process. We had to do it on a dime, but it was collaborative, it was collegial, and both the elected government and the public service leadership, all the players and the unions all understood what was going on. I understand that while nowhere near as severe, we are facing a certain kind of problem because of the absolute uncertainty about provincial funding. I'm tempted to call it the provincial clown car, where you don't know from day to day what funding is available for the operation of our service. And I get that that's a problem. I also get that there was a live conversation taking place prior to the Premier walking back his decision to arbitrarily cut public health funding retroactively. There was a live conversation about the City of Toronto backfilling that funding. It was openly talked about. Several mayors across the province of Ontario said that they would do that in the event that the province did not step up. So there is a willingness to at least have the conversation that if there is a shortfall in Toronto public health that is not allowing Torontonians to receive the services that this board and Toronto City Council committed to delivering, to whether or not the City of Toronto would step in. There's a willingness to have that conversation. I am concerned from what I've heard today, and it wasn't presented in writing, it was an offhand verbal comment during a presentation, that we are not filling the positions of people in public health, and as the medical officer of health has repeatedly said to us, the overwhelming majority of cost to deliver those services is people. So where we lose people, we lose the ability to deliver those services. I feel very strongly that we have an oversight responsibility as a board to make sure those services are put in place. And if the medical officer of health feels that we need to withdraw staff from those services, we should be informed. We have not been to date. It was not in the written presentation, and I'm deeply concerned that what we have is not adequate. I'm hoping that the chair, in his wisdom, because he's closer to these things than I am, can make some kind of a recommendation on how we as a board should direct the medical officer of health to make sure that the public health services that we want, that the city wants, and very clearly from the reaction of the province's threatened cuts, we know Torontonians want, is not threatened by a cost containment exercise, which we have not directed.
Thank you. Other speakers? Director Layton.
I'll just briefly point out, because this makes me, this budget in particular, it makes me really nervous, right? When you start talking about modernizing in healthcare and with a limited amount of resources, we know what that means, right? When commissioner, whatever, director, whatever, Councillor Gord mentioned that this budget is predominantly a staff cost budget. That's the same for a lot of budgets, a lot of forward-facing social service budgets at the City of Toronto. And just by using a magic eraser and taking money out of the budget and saying that you're doing it in the name of modernizing doesn't necessarily result in better services for people. And this language of modernizing isn't new. I just looked up the 2019 budget analyst notes. It was all in there. Modernizing, transforming, innovating. This wasn't put on us by the province. This is work that we constantly do. And as it's work that we're constantly doing, we're constantly generating savings. It said in the same budget analyst notes, the base budget that staff brought back to City Council from Public Health was lower than the previous year. The base budget found savings. We were already reducing the budget. The budget increased because of new and enhanced funding that came from council direction. So these service increases are what drove the budget over. So we were finding efficiencies. So let's not think now all of a sudden that the province is in, that we're all of a sudden going to get enormously better at this. Of course we'll find some savings, but we're not going to get to hundreds or to $20 million, $30 million in savings. I'd also point out to Director Lai's comment, we do already rely on private sector money for our student nutrition program. If we continually, as governments in general, but as this particular body, as this board, start to say, well, let's put more of that on the private sector, what happens when the private sector don't have a good financial year? What happens when they decide to, as RBC has done this year, as TD has done this year, as most major financial institutions have done, have decided to reevaluate their charitable contributions and their partnerships? We've lost major festivals because of this in the City of Toronto, because they've decided to put their money into other things, and we have no say, absolutely no say. So this is one of the areas where, like, fixing roads is one thing. You can add a year on, you can, like, it doesn't get any better, it's worse service, but these are people's lives that are in the mix in this one. And so we cannot, and I would make one recommendation, that in the discussions of this document, if you could also include what efficiencies that public health has found over the last many years, but not just our budget year to year, because we have been increasing service. And I'm damn proud to have been part of a council that has voted to increase and improve public service while finding savings, yes, but actually improve the lives of people, because what we're doing is putting them at risk if we're doing nothing but just trying to find places to remove services and cut money out of the budget. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other speakers? All right. I'll put myself on the list and begin, and I have an amendment, which I'll speak to. In the amendment, I will be moving recommendations from our Board of Health Budget Committee First of all, as part of the September meeting, to bring forward options for savings that do not negatively impact the health status of Torontonians, to bring forward revenue options as was articulated, to bring forward an update on the development of an alternative proposal for public health restructuring that I'll speak to, a specific direction which is to not implement a hiring freeze in year. If such a proposal is made, I would like it to be brought here. That is above and beyond gapping in the normal course. So let me begin, first of all, by thanking staff in Toronto Public Health. It has been a very challenging number of months for our staff, as well as members of our Board of Health Budget Committee and this board. It is not often in my 5 years, very brief 5 years at the Board of Health, I have never had as many conversations around the table around the budget as we have right now. The future is somewhat uncertain for the following reasons. One, this board, this city, and this province, we won the reversal of the retroactive cut. So we did win that. But the future is unknown. And the future is unknown because the Premier's office have told us that there is a reset and they want to work with us to come up with a new funding model for the future. The Chief Medical Officer of Health says that he has not been formally communicated those directions, and thus it's simply a deferral. And so we're stuck in limbo with the provincial government trying to figure out who's in charge and what the direction is. And so my concern here is that without proactive work, we will sleepwalk back into the previous model proposed of cuts. With the principle being that the best opposition is proposition, the recommendation here, which is 1C, that Dr. Davila spoke to, is for us as the Board of Health, for Dr. Davila as our Medical Officer of Health, in collaboration with other Medical Officers of Health, with the Association of Public Health Agencies and others, is to put forward an alternative restructuring proposal. I think there's wide recognition that 35 public health units in the province is not the exact right number of units. I have yet to meet anyone who thinks that 35 is accurate. Should it be 28? Should it be 25? We don't know. I've yet to speak to anybody in the public health community who doesn't believe that there are some services that could be centralized across public health units. And so there is a restructuring model that is focused on the effective delivery of public health services as opposed to simply cost cutting as an overarching objective, but a model which would reduce costs. It would just maintain population health. And so I think that 1C is critical, and we'll talk about that. But in the fall, we're going to spend a lot of time on the budget, because in the fall, we will either be coming to this board asking perhaps to endorse an alternative model and going to work to sell it. We may also, in addition to that, be asking this board to consider savings that don't impact the health status, looking at revenue options. All that is to say is in this fall, we will have to be ready for any outcome. We're not going to sit back, but we will be ready for any outcome, and we will ensure that the health status of Torontonians remains our first and foremost our priority, and we won't let cost-cutting or revenue options get in the way of that. With that, I'll conclude my remarks. Questions of the mover? Yep.
Thank you, Chair Cressy. For 1C,
yes.
What do you see as a formal mechanism to submit this through? Like, is there a public consultation process? Would this be done through the meeting and the committee that you're setting up? Like, how would this be transmitted to the provincial government and dealt with?
So as we're into questions of me, I'll respond and I'll let Dr. Davila afterwards come over and chat as necessary. So currently, conversations are happening amongst medical officers of health, amongst chairs of boards of health around a potential alternative model, one that would be ideally brought to boards to consider, as well as to ALPHA, the Association of Public Health Agencies, and thus shared with the province, providing a better option. So that would, an update on the development of that and the potential consideration or ask of this board to consider it would be coming this fall. So that's the format in which those conversations are taking. these technical tables, we haven't had a meeting yet. In fact, I can tell you that in the suggestion, in the request for the city to participate in a technical table with the province, it was explicitly stated that political representatives were not invited. And so I don't have a lot of, I am cautious of these technical tables, but Dr. Davila is proceeding in good faith.
And for number 2, if they have identified that this is a position that's no longer needed because there's been some sort of modernization and they are, through attrition, is that different than what you're saying here within hiring freeze? Because I think in the comments that we heard from the chief medical officer, like she was stating that she felt that there'd been no reduction in service and that they've been able to manage that within. So how does this relate to what we heard her speak to previously?
So if there is, I want to just have it very clear from the Board of Health that an in-year hiring freeze, if that is brought forward, that's something that we will talk about, but that is not the direction from this board. We have a frequent process of assessing gapping and looking at how we can continue to deliver service as there's gapping, but there has been no request to implement an in-year hiring freeze, and I want to make sure that that's the direction from this board.
So if it comes back that they feel that positions could be eliminated because there's been modernization or changes in technology, et cetera, you're okay with that? You just want this to be clear that we are not ordering an in-house?
That's correct. If
That's
there,
not our direction? Okay.
That's correct. That is exactly correct. Okay. Anybody else to speak? All right. All budget all the time this year at the Board of Health. We have a motion on the table. All those in favor? Opposed, if any? Okay, that carries. Is there an item as amended on this? No, because it was just the presentation. All right. I believe that brings this meeting to a close. Have a great summer for those who are getting away. And we'll see you all in the fall, if not sooner.